Abstract Expressionism was the first important American art movement in painting, the first to command the attention of the entire world after the Second World War. The major artists, Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock, Clyfford Still, created minimal expressions on large canvases, engulfing the viewer and inviting an individual reaction. Clyfford Still especially was totally devoted to his work, to the point that he felt the need to escape the commercial art world. Nearly his entire life's work remained in his possession until after his death in 1980. It is now curated and shown in a singular museum in Denver, where the task of caring for such a collection is immense. "830 paintings, many still stored in rolls, most never before seen by the public. Hundreds of works on paper, 1,000 other items, writings, clippings, tools, memorabilia. Clyfford Still was a man intensely engaged in art, intellectually, emotionally, prolifically.
There's immense correspondence between Clyfford Still and every important abstract expressionist painter, critic, but there's also an immense photography collection. We also have his personal library.
By the late 40s and into the 1950s, in other words, right when he started to get pretty successful and famous, he started saving more of those things.
Palette knives, pastels, pigments, the large canvases, and the smaller works on paper.
He's working through color balance, he's working through form, line gesture, the same things that you see come up in some of the paintings, what he would consider a fully fledged painting, even if it's on paper. These kind of daily processing of his artistic themes. And they harken back to the same, color, spatial, layout, composition of his entire visual vocabulary.
For 5 years, the conservation team at the Still Museum has been unwrapping and cataloging everything that Still and his wife Patricia carefully saved.
Paintings that are unstretched and rolled on tubes, drawings that don't have mats, so they're difficult to handle, archives that were dumped into boxes and trying to keep some sense of the original order, but having an intellectual sense of what they are.
If you look closely at the surface of this, you can see that this form was added at a later date, which...
Assessing aging factors, cleaning, making decisions on how or whether to restore damage from storage. It takes art and science.
Conservators are calling on basically chemistry to figure out, to characterize the materials and then to develop cleaning systems and solvents to use. In this case, I'll be able to remove some of this haze off the surface and using small swabs because we want to work in a very controlled manner.
Still's major works were done in oil paint. 70 years later, some aren't completely dry and may not look the way they did when they were painted.
We haven't defined what is acceptable and unacceptable aging characteristics of these works. So we're in the process right now of discovering these works themselves by literally unrolling them and revealing them to the world for the first time in 75 years. But then we are also having to make decisions about what are acceptable and unacceptable changes, natural changes that occur over time.
Well, there are a fair amount of challenges here at the museum, some fascinating, some more mundane. I mean, one thing is we are really learning the collection at about the same pace as our audience. It really is the most intact body of work we can identify from any century. Since we have 95% of it here at the Denver collection, and virtually none of that was shown much during his lifetime, and certainly not at all after his death, we're just discovering it along with all of you.
So this machine here is a colorimeter, and using a specific light source, we can measure the color that we get in the LAB color mapping system, and we will continue to measure it over time and have an understanding of how the color changes. We would like to have an understanding of the materials and how they behave within the collection so that we can make specifications for display. So that we can say if this work is extremely sensitive, you only can display it 4 months out of 5 years. And just limit that exposure so that we can continue to display the work for as long as possible.
Supporting all the art is the wealth of writing Clyfford Still did in letters and diary entries.
When I was a young man, I painted many landscapes, especially of the prairie and of men and machines. For in such a land, a man must stand upright if he would live, even if he is the only upright form in the world about him.
Traditionally, the vertical forms in his works allude to this idea of a lifeline, this idea that of human struggle, and that if you're vertical, you're living, if you're horizontal, you're dead.
And so was born and became intrinsic this elemental characteristic of my life and work. In later years, the human spirit and its imaging fully engaged me.
As part of the conservation effort, the Clyfford Still Museum has been building a digital record of all the items in the collection to allow scholars and art lovers online access. Perhaps, says Dean Sobel, to study ahead of a visit to Denver, the only place in the world to see this breadth of the artist's work.
I think we've achieved what we set out to do, was reintroduce this artist to the world. And now I think, like probably any person in charge of a legacy of an artist or interested in an artist in the way we are, it's a kind of lifetime and ongoing effort.
Our story about preserving the art of Clyfford Still and sharing it with the world is part of a special collaboration with our public media partners in Colorado. To learn about how the Clyfford Still Museum has become a part of the city's cultural fabric in 5 years, look for a special street-level segment at cpt12.org. And you can go to cpr.org to find a Denver composer's new piece combining music with writing from Still's journals and recorded at Colorado Public Radio. You'll also hear the story behind the composition. Look for Centennial Sounds podcast.